Welcome to the Performing Arts Series brought to you by the Kennedy Center and the Prince William Network. I'm Maria Salvador, your moderator for today's program. Before we get started, I want to remind you that today's program is interactive, and you'll have an opportunity to ask us questions later in the broadcast by calling our 800 number or by emailing us. We look forward to hearing from you. I'm joined in the studio audience by students from Bevel Middle School and Woodbridge Senior High School. With us is award-winning author, illustrator, and artist Christopher Myers. His illustrations have been awarded the Caldecott Honor, more than one Coretta Scott King Award honor, and several of his books have been named ALA, American Library Association, Notable Books for Young Readers. Welcome, Christopher Myers.
Hi, glad to be here.
You come from a family of storytellers. How did you choose to tell stories through art and become a storyteller in your own right?
Well, number one, it's a good job. When I was growing up, I watched my father, and he would walk down the hallway to his computer, and he'd work on his novels and his books, and I thought, it's a good job. He gets up, he doesn't get dressed to go to work, and I like that a lot. And I'm also an artist, and this is something that I've been doing since I was very young. I've been drawing since I was a kid, and I thought, wow, that's a really great thing that I can do to make my hobby, the work that I love to do, that I would be doing anyway, into a job. My grandfather was a storyteller. He couldn't read, but he was a storyteller. My father was a storyteller, and I think that if the world was fair, a great storyteller like my grandfather would have been able to make a living at it. But I have the opportunity to, and it's something I want to do.
Well, you've said talent without work is really nothing. Talk about that a little. What do you mean?
One of the things that's really disturbing to me about the way that the world puts images of artists out there in the world is that they put these images of artists out there as if artists don't do work to get where they are. So you have, let's say a rapper or an actor, and all you get is the end of the story, the overnight success. But that overnight success was made from years and years and weeks of hustle and work and pain. And for me, I feel like there are a lot of people out there who can draw. But what's going to separate me as an illustrator or as an artist away from those people who can just draw is that I'm going to put more work into it than you will. And, people say, well, why do you want to come out and talk to kids? Why? I come out to talk to kids for one reason alone, which is to steal ideas. Because for the most part, kids, and that's the truth. I don't know yes, that's the truth. I'm stealing ideas because for the most part, kids aren't willing sometimes to do the work. I spend about a year on each book. Kids aren't willing to do that. And if they're not willing to do that, I feel like it's my right to take their ideas and make money.
All right. Well, but you use a very specific medium. Did you always know that art told stories?
Well, when I was really young, my family had rules about watching TV, for example.
Okay.
And the rules were I could watch as much TV as I wanted, but I would have to write essays about what I had seen. And so I would have to, for example, keep a list of everything I saw a black person doing on television that day. And this was, early 80s. I'm sitting there, and you realize after a while that all these images do tell stories. These images tell very complex and complicated stories about what the society expects from you. So when I'm talking about the idea that artists aren't shown working, that's an image that we see. And as someone who works in images, I'm very, very conscious of the stories that my images tell. So you don't see the image of Lil Wayne, for example, in the studio working for hours and hours on end. What you see is the music video at the end. Even in the music video, you don't see the image of the 27-hour day that they're shooting that music video. You just see the 3-minute clip that makes it look so effortless. I've been on music video sets. I've met pretty much most of the random hip-hop stars in the world, and you realize that these folks work really, really hard. And that's the thing that separates them from that guy in your lunchroom who can, rhyme a little bit. That's what separates me from that guy who can draw a horse. I can draw anything, and I work hard and I draw every day.
All right. Are you conscious of your audience, that you're telling stories to young people?
Yes and no. Yes, I am conscious of my audience in terms of I think that my job as an artist is to communicate something to someone else. And so if it's not communicated, then I failed. So I'm conscious in that way. At the same time, in the end, all the books I make are about things that I'm interested in. And my hope is, and my belief is, that the broad circle of my own interests overlaps with the circles of everyone else's interests out there. So I'm interested in art, I'm interested in music, I'm interested in social issues, I'm interested in that overlapping in which my interests overlap with other people's interests. So for example, right now, I'm working on a manuscript about child soldiers in Sierra Leone. And here are these kids, a million miles away from my home in Brooklyn, but I feel like their lives intersect with my life because I too have been a young person affected by violence. I too have seen violence in my neighborhood, and I've seen the way that violence gets inside of young people, and therefore their story overlaps with my story, and therefore all of my work is about that sort of really localized, what I'm interested in, as well as hopefully overlapping with the world and what the world's interested in.
Well, you work with kids of all ages, and your work appeals to readers of all ages.
Hopefully.
Well, I think it does. Let's take a look at a short clip courtesy of WETA's readingrockets.org. In the clip, you make a visit to PS 304 in New York City, where you meet a group of younger children.
Whoa! It's PS 304 in New York City. Let's see what's happening.
Here comes Christopher Myers!
Wow, this guy looks like some kind of rock star, but his fans are less than half his size. That's because his job is writing books for kids. What's that all about? Let's get to know him. Mr. Myers, what makes you tick? What rocks your world? Exactly who is Christopher Myers?
My job is to tell stories about my neighborhood, about where I come from, about where I grew up.
It seemed to me, Icarus,
I think everyone has stories to tell. This is one of the things I'm really interested in, is telling kids that I don't care who you are, you have a story to tell. I wanted to do a book about a kid who is different because I'm different, okay? Because I got big feet, because I'm tall.
He is different.
What's wrong with my hair? Because I got curly hair, Who else here is different?
Because I have big feet too.
You're different because you have big feet too? All right. Growing up, I was the tallest one in my class. I was the youngest one in my class. I've always had big feet. It took me a long time to learn that all those things were cool. I want to write a story with you, okay? I'll do the pictures. The first thing I need is a character.
A boy named Anthony.
A boy named Anthony. Okay, does Anthony have big eyes or little eyes?
Big eyes.
Big eyes. Okay, that's Anthony. Every story has characters and has a problem. So what's Anthony's problem gonna be?
Big feet.
So Anthony had big feet. How big was Anthony's feet?
Like yours.
Like mine? You saying I got big feet again?
Big feet.
So you tell me when to stop.
Stop. Stop.
What?
No.
What? Okay, I'm gonna stop. Now I'm supposed to stop? All right.
That's too big. Too big.
But that's his problem. That's a problem. That's a for real problem there.
He is swollen.
How's he gonna fix his problem?
You can solve the problem by giving Anthony a plastic surgery.
A what?
A plastic surgery.
A plastic surgery on his feet. My grandfather couldn't read. And yet he was one of the best storytellers I ever met. I used to sit on his knee and he would tell me these stories about everything from radioactive bunnies running around, and he would scare you. He could tell a story like nobody's business. Who here likes to read? Who here doesn't like to read?
I think it's hard.
Because it's hard sometimes. Do you think it's sometimes hard for me when I make books?
No.
No, it is hard sometimes. Sometimes it's hard. Does that mean it's bad? No, sometimes some of the good things, some of the fun things to do are hard to do, you know? And that's one of the things that you need to remember. If you feel like sometimes reading is hard, that's okay. We're all having a hard time with something, and I don't care who you are. There are books that I will read one time, feel like I know what it's about, then read another time and find that it's about a whole nother thing. It doesn't matter how good of a reader you are, because you will always get to be a better and better reader. And look at you, you're touching my shoes. I told you never touch my shoes. It doesn't matter what it is that goes on in your life. The things that make you you are the things that you need to be proud of.
Your art is visually sophisticated, and frankly, so is the story. The book you shared with the children at PS 304 is Wings, a story steeped in mythology. How come you chose to use the Icarus story?
There's a bunch of reasons why I was interested in Icarus. Number one, I wanted to do an anti-Ugly Duckling story.
All right, anti-Ugly Duckling. I'm sorry, I don't get it.
Well, in the Ugly Duckling story, the Ugly Duckling turns a corner at some point and runs into a bunch of swans that look like him. And, you know, I've been running around for quite some time trying to turn some corner, hoping to find somebody who's a lot like me. And I realized that I'm going to be different. I'm going to continue kind of being different. Probably I'll be an old little different man. People will walk down the street and be like, look at that old different man, you know? And so I wanted to do a book about a kid who was different, who had problems of being different, but then stayed different, that didn't find its sameness by finding all this other community that looked just like them. That was one thing. And I also wanted to do a book that confronted the Icarus myth directly, because the story, the moral behind the Icarus myth was don't be too ambitious. And I really think that that's a really bad moral for, you know, our kids today. This idea that, you know, don't fly too close to the sun. I wanted to do a book about a kid who flew as close to the sun as he wanted to. I mean, that's really what I think that all of these books are about in some ways, is about opening up a possibility for a kid, opening up a possibility for a young reader, opening up a possibility. That idea of opening possibilities is really important to me.
Well, you've said you write about your neighborhood, but when I read Wings or any of your other books, your neighborhood becomes my neighborhood and anybody's neighborhood that reads the book. So
hopefully, I mean, the idea is that this idea of opening possibilities makes people realize that their neighborhood extends far beyond themselves. So no one person exists as simply just themselves, you know. So I'm part of the community of artists. I'm part of the community of African Americans. I'm part of the community of people who have been different somehow in their lives. I'm part of the community that's been affected by violence. I'm part of the community that's affected by war right now. These are all things, communities that I'm part of. And so I hope to, through my books, make people aware that they're part of a bunch of communities all at once. People always want us to be one thing, and nobody really is just one thing. You know, one of the things that's exciting about being out here today is the idea that you get to see some of the other people who share in your community. You get to hear from the internet or from the phone calls, which I hope someone's calling, please, Lord. You know, you get to see from those kind of things, you know, whose communities you overlap with.
And you convey that through art, which is a universal language.
Well, I mean, we live in a time like no other in terms of the emphasis on images. You know, when you look at how much television there is in the world and how many magazines there are in the world, we live by photos nowadays in a way that we didn't 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago. We live in a world of images, and I think it's really important for us to be able to read those images as well as being able to read the words on pages. So we can ask ourselves, you know, why is this image, for example, this is like a little quirky one, but you'll see in the media, there's a lot of images of African Americans on telephones. When you see in the ads, like just watch television, you'll see that there's a bunch of black people on telephones. Why? I'm not 100% sure. Part of it is maybe that they're marketing to us. I don't know. But you have to ask yourself these questions about images. And I think that hopefully my books, allow for just an introduction to this idea of visual literacy.
Why don't we talk about that in a few minutes? Because I want to talk about jazz.
All right.
All right. You've worked with an author who's kind of well known, and you know him a little bit.
Yeah, I work with my dad sometimes.
Yeah.
I work with two kinds of authors: my father, myself, and then dead people.
So is that to minimize problems?
That's to minimize problems and profit sharing issues.
Okay. That makes sense.
And so, my father and I, we worked on a book together called Jazz, because my father's old and likes jazz. And so this is our book Jazz, which is done fairly well, and we're really excited by it.
Well, it's a Coretta Scott King Honor book for the illustrations.
That was a thrill. That was absolutely a thrill to win an award for this book. And it's for me, it's about a community of artists. One of the things about jazz musicians that I find was really useful for me growing up was here were a bunch of African-American artists that were pushing the envelope of their form to the extreme, and these were some of the first people I could look at as artists to model my own life and to say, okay, well, this is how you can make a living, make a world for yourself through your art. And that was one of the real gifts of jazz for me.
Well, hands figure prevalently in this book, and it's, I think, a visual theme that's in a lot of your books. But on the title page, there are hands on drums that are like leading into the book. And talk about why you use hands, because you work with your hands. And
well, there's a part of me that never has been too comfortable with the image of artist as mad genius who just throws paint onto a canvas. And there's a part of me that much more thinks of myself as an artist, as a worker, as somebody who works with my hands. I make things. I feel there's something really straightforward about that equation, where I make things and that's how I make my living. And I really love the idea that so many of the artists that I respect work with their hands. My father, he types all the time. These musicians on drums and saxophone, this is our hands are our way to put something out into the world. We listen with our ears, we receive with our eyes, but to really build something concrete, you use your hands. And I think of the work that I do, the ideological work, the work in thinking about image, I think of that as something concrete I can put out into the world, and I do that with my hands.
Well, we talked earlier about the movement or the tension perhaps between the words and the image. You want to read jazz to us and
well,
read Miss. Tell us about Miss Kitty. I think she's the one we want to go to.
So, my father wrote a poem called "Oh Miss Kitty." Again, my father is an old man. He concerns himself with old man ideas. One of his old man ideas, and there's nothing wrong being an old man, they're brilliant ideas, was about a woman, a big, round, big, fat woman dancing. And he wanted to make a story about that. And I thought, Pop, that's a little rough. So he wrote this poem. Oh, Miss Kitty, she's as round as she is tall. I said, oh, Miss Kitty, she's as round as she is tall. Ain't nothing about Miss Kitty you would say is small. Dance, Miss Kitty, dance to the break of dawn. You've been dancing, Miss Kitty, since the day you was born. Oh, Miss Kitty, she's in love with the piano man. Tickle them ivories, boy. Oh, Miss Kitty, she's in love with the piano man. Hit the white keys, too. He's a slitty-eyed gangster, but he play like he got a plan. So I thought that was a bit risque for a kid's book. But I also thought about friends that I had growing up. I knew this one young woman played cello and called her cello Conquisha. And I knew that a lot of my friends named their instruments. And so I thought Miss Kitty would function better as a bass fiddle than as a big round woman dancing. So that's how I illustrated it. So there's, again, this tension between the words and the image. You can tell one story with the words. You can totally change that story with the image. one of the things that, so when, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. So in general, in any picture book I do, especially this is something I argue about with my pop, is who's doing the most work. And if a picture's worth 1,000 words, I think it's very clear who's doing the most work. That would be me. Mind you, he's not here right now, so that's good to. I can say whatever I want to say about him,
And he's not here to respond, but he's
Exactly.
going to watch
Well, I like
this
that.
and oh, he's going to get you later.
Yeah, he will. He will.
Did you finish reading Miss Kitty?
Oh, well, there's another verse.
Well, read the last verse.
See, this is another thing. When you're an artist, you start to disregard the words. So, dance, Miss Kitty, dance to the break of dawn. You've been dancing, Miss Kitty, since the day that you was born. What's the saxophone man doing? He plays it high, and he plays with so much feeling. Yeah, he plays it high, and he plays with so much feeling. Go get some water, 'cause he's burning up the ceiling. Dance, Miss Kitty, dance to the break of dawn. You've been dancing, Miss Kitty, since the day that you was born.
That moves and sways. But there's a whole nother kind of poetry that really doesn't have a lot of meaning behind it, or at least it didn't for me until I read your recent book, Jabberwocky. Now, Jabberwocky is an old poem, but you illustrated it in a brand new way and created meaning. You tell us about that book. I mean,
well, okay. So one of the things that is really surprising to me or kind of funny to me is you make a book and then you don't know where it's going to go. I made a book called Black Cat, and it was a book about Brooklyn,
right,
about where I lived. All the illustrations took place within about 3 blocks of my house. And I got letters from Puerto Rico and Tanzania and Nebraska about, oh, this book relates to me, and this is a black cat in my neighborhood. And these people were hanging out with cows and sending me pictures of black cats with cows, and that's so far from my life. And so I started to think about this idea of, you make a story, you don't know where it's going to go. And I started to look at stories that I loved and thought about people who would never have thought that I was going to love them, that some so this is a poem that I loved since I was a kid. Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll, the guy who wrote Alice in Wonderland. So it was written mid-1800s. This English mathematician guy writes this thing. And I'm thinking about this English mathematician guy in the mid-1800s and how there's no way that he could think that little me, in Brooklyn, when I was a kid, would be sitting around saying, oh, this is a great poem. And so I was thinking about what the poem meant to me. And I realized that it was clearly a basketball story, because, and mind you, this man probably never knew from basketball, but at the same time, this is what I was interested in. So I'll read you some of the poem and I'll show you what it looked like to me when I was growing up. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the bar groves and the mum rats outgrabe. And I was clear that this was about little girls playing jump rope, because they were gyring and gimbling in the wave, which is what little girls do, I think. And I double dutch in my neighborhood, this is what I see. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jub bird and shun the frumious bandersnatch. So this here is an illustration of the jub bird and the frumious bandersnatch. Now, around my way, over on Myrtle Ave, there's a basketball courts that you always see the craziest dudes playing. There's always a little skinny dude who can move fast but really doesn't shoot very well. Then there's always an even smaller dude who does shoot really well from the outside. And then there's always a big dude who you're a little bit intimidated by. I realized that was what the Jabberwock meant. So I continued the story in this terms of this basketball metaphor. He took his vorpal sword in hand, a long time the Manx's own foe he sought. So rested he by the tum-tum tree and stood a while in thought. Tum-tum tree, clearly chain link fence, which figures largely in my life. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 2, and through, the vorpal blade went snicker-snack, clearly a swish sound, yes. he left it dead, and with its head, he went galumphing back. When I was a kid, when you really wanted to challenge somebody, you play them for their ball, because not everyone had a ball. So you could play somebody for their ball. And I remembered that, galumphing back with someone's ball when I won. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, Callooh Calais, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy wore the borogroves, and the mumrats outgrabe. This kid's playing in the fire hydrant, which is yet another thing from my neighborhood. So,
Well, it's the first time that poem made sense to me.
see, I think that really this is what Lewis Carroll was trying to get at. It was all about Brooklyn in the 80s.
Oh, okay. 1980s.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, there are a couple of things that intrigue me about that. The style of illustration is different, different than jazz, different than anything that you've done to this point, at least that I'm aware of. But also the text, the typeface, and is part of the design of the book and creates image in a unique way.
Well, two things come to mind when you say that. Number one is, pretty much for every book, I come up with a new medium. I do it in a different way because every book is not the same. It's like, if I was a musician, if I came out with the same album over and over and over again, some musicians do that. They're not called good musicians, but they're musicians. Similarly, I'm interested in making something a little different each time. Something that kind of speaks to I want the medium to speak to what the message of the book is. And then in terms of design, you talk about visual literacy. This is one of the things that is also a revolution nowadays. Everyone is designing everything. And the more I've done these books, the more I've paid attention to design, the more I've paid attention to how the book is laid out and how the book is put together as an object, because that's kind of how your eyes are pointed here or there. So for example, this is like a common design thing. If you want the kids to kind of understand about the importance of design, you see every Chinese food restaurant has got that Chinese food restaurant font on it that has nothing to do with Chinese. Do you know what I'm talking about? I'm talking to y'all in our studio audience. I mean, I want people to call and everything, but you know what I'm talking about? That's what design is. Someone decided that that's a Chinese design,
Well, what you're saying essentially is that regardless of the medium, there are certain words that artists use or certain techniques that artists use to convey meaning.
Absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely. And the question is, why did they use this one over using that one?
Okay, so how can I, as a non-artist, learn the language of the artist?
Well,
maybe you could show us. Maybe you could demonstrate. And look, there's an easel, and I bet there's a marker.
I am so surprised that
yes.
there is a marker and an easel here. Who would have thought I would have been asked to draw? No. So let's talk about how I come up with a character. In fact, let's come up with a character together. Okay? Say yes, y'all. Yes. What I need is I need something about a character. Give me something. Give me an animal. Shout it out.
Giraffe.
Giraffe. I like
Dog.
giraffes. Why do I like giraffes?
Different.
Exactly, right? Because they're just like closer to God that way. What's this giraffe's name? I gotta get Stephen. Stephen the giraffe.
And while Stephen is being created on the easel, I'd like to invite the viewing audience to begin sending in their questions. We'd love to hear from you.
Really, we would love to hear. I would love to hear from you, because if you have good ideas, I'd like to steal them or something of that sort.
Okay, now on to Stephen the giraffe.
Okay, so we're gonna draw a giraffe named Stephen. Stephen has to have a problem. In every book you do, every story you write, you're gonna have to have a problem. Because his what? His tongue is too big. All right, Stephen the giraffe got just a huge tongue. So Let's start with his little giraffe antenna.
Well, it's interesting to me how you're using line. Why did you choose to put your pen down where you did on the page? Because that's composition. You know, that's where your eye is focused, and that's the beginning of the story.
I mean, when I was a kid, I used to always do drawings and start them one place on the page and not be able to finish them. Have you ever had that? Where all of a sudden the feet were over here, and I'd get another piece of paper and put it down. And this is just part of experience. So this is our friend the giraffe.
He's got a rather long neck.
See, that's how you know he's a giraffe. See,
Okay.
because he got a long neck. That's how they do. So he got a long tongue.
Oh my.
What's funny about that? That's just wrong. Stephen got a little problem. Y'all laughing at him.
Well, you know, my guess is that the placement on the page. Oh, that's really disgusting looking, Chris.
Oh, thank you. This is my art. This is my art. I put the pain, sweat, blood, and tears. You're gonna tell me it's disgusting looking. Look, it's his problem. So that's Stephen the giraffe. So then this is how I go about making a book. I come up with a character, and then I give the character a problem. Or I hear about a problem that happens in the world. So, and then I figure out some kind of visual representation of that. For example, right now, another book that I'm just finished is about something that happened in Harlem a couple of years ago, about an animal. A guy had a tiger in his apartment, and the tiger bit him. And so then he got arrested, because you ain't supposed to have tigers in your apartment. So this is another thing I'm working on. But these are the kind of like decisions that constitute my work. This is my job, is to come up with things like Stephen the Long-Tongued Giraffe. I really don't know what to do with Stephen the Long-Tongued Giraffe in terms of what's next. But what I'll do whenever I come up with a character, first thing is draw it, see what it looks like, and see if I'll be able to carry this out. One of the problems with Stephen the Long-Tongued Giraffe, I think, is that it is kind of gross looking. I'm gonna have to come up with something about with it to make it work more in terms
Maybe
of, because also every time you do a book, you have to do like 30 to 40 illustrations. So that means I'm gonna have to draw this long-tongued giraffe 30 to 40 times at least, and have it look different each time. So I like this drawing because it's kind of funny.
Well, do you always start out with a drawing?
Well, a lot of times that's how I think. I think visually. I think very much in terms of images. So that's something I'm always doing. Give me another character. You, I already got the. All right, we don't work on that. I'm gonna draw you. Hold on, if I draw you, you need to stay. All right, we're gonna draw you. Don't move. All right, and I'm gonna talk while I'm drawing you. So you ask me questions. So I'm gonna try to do this multitasking thing.
Well, one of the questions that I want to ask you has to do with color, and you use color to great effect in Jabberwocky.
Keep turning.
Oh, he's
All right,
he's
that's good. That's good.
Okay. This is very distracting, Chris.
I'm sorry. I'm listening.
No, you're not.
I'm so listening.
Okay.
Color Jabberwocky. I'm hearing you.
Well, I there's huge color in Jabberwocky. There's a rich palette. In Blues Journey, another book that you did with your dad, you use a very limited palette. It's a story about the blues. It's an examination of the blues, and the art reflects the story of the blues very, very well.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to do with that is reflect the way in which the blues has a really limited palette in terms of what one can do with the blues. Like the blues is made of very simple chord structures, very simple. You move it, man. I told you not to move. Simple chord structures, simple like lyrical structures, but at the same time, there's a lot of beauty and richness that comes from that. And so that's what I wanted to do with the blues, with Blues Journey, is I wanted to make something that used a really simple structure, but at the same time had a lot of richness to it. So for example, right now, I'm drawing Stephen. I'm using real simple structure with Stephen, because that's Stephen, you know. I know Stephen, he's simple that way. And so, hold on. And so this is one of the things that I find is really important, is to always have the work be reflect the medium, like reflect the subject. So the medium should reflect the subject. Everything that you think about, the color, the line, weight, the medium, all of it should go back to what is the subject? Why are you doing this thing, you know?
You deal with some really, really tough topics in Blues Journey. Two that stand out for me are Parchman, which is a notorious penitentiary, state penitentiary in Mississippi, and the other is Strange Fruit, which is about a lynching.
Yes.
And again, you kind of soften the blow of those two really tough topics. It could have taken on a whole different meaning had you illustrated it differently. Could you talk at least about how you came up with the image that accompanies Strange Fruit?
Well, Stephen, that's vaguely you. Hold on, go back. With Strange Fruit, one of the things that was the challenge, and this is something I believe in, I believe that there is no topic that's not suitable for children if you present it well. Strange Fruit is about lynching. Lynching is it's a horrible, horrible thing. And so rather than focus on the victim aspect of that, I wanted to focus on what people did about lynching at the time. So I thought of a child who was protesting lynching. And I thought that communicated a lot more than the classic images of a body hanging from a tree, because too often, especially in terms of African American history, we're portrayed as victims. And that's not something that I'm particularly interested in. Oftentimes, as an illustrator, people offer me books in various sorts that want to talk about like hard periods in African American history, and my guiding light is the idea that I'm not going to portray my people or any people as victims. You know, young women aren't victims, young black people aren't victims. This is not a genre that I'm particularly interested in. So.
Well, when you finish sketching Stephen, would you come over here and read a couple?
Yeah, I think Stephen's pretty done. I don't think I've fully captured his beauty and wiseness that comes through. You wise, man, you wise. But I tried a little something. So that's Stephen, and I'm gonna come back and read.
All right. I've got Parchman and Strange Fruit marked, and if you want to share them with us, I'd be grateful.
Surely.
Start with.
So this again, this is about lynching. Strange fruit hanging high in a big oak tree. Strange fruit hanging high in a big oak tree. You can see what it did to Willie. Can you see what it does to me? Again, this is about the idea that lynching was something that happened and then it affected a whole community. And that was a hard thing to try and figure out how to illustrate. This one, I'm busting sod on parchments if the sun don't lay me low. You know I'm busting sod on parchments if the sun don't lay me low. There's 9 kinds of dying a rich man will never know. So with this illustration, one of the things that I found interesting or fun about it was I had to figure, I'm from the city, I don't know anything about country living. So I had to figure out, how do people swing a pickaxe? So I went and bought a pickaxe, and I was out in front of my apartment in Brooklyn, swinging his pickaxe. All the neighbors were looking at me, talking about, what's he doing? I was like, figuring out how to do this work.
You raise a really interesting point, I think, and that I don't think people associate research with illustration. You just draw what you draw. But how do you research, and what is the role of research in art?
I do a lot of research. I grew up as a researcher. It was like my first jobs was going to libraries and doing research for other people. And you know, for whatever you want to do in this world, there's somebody who's done some of it already, and you should figure out what they do. So if you want to be a musician, let's say you want to be a rapper. Listen to everybody. You need to listen to people to hear that, you know, so-and-so's lyrics are really hot and complex. So-and-so's lyrics, for example, I don't feel like 50 Cent, for example, does a lot of research on lyrics because his lyrical complexity, a little low. Whereas you look at like Lupe Fiasco, really, really like interesting lyrics, very complex. And so this is the same kind of thing I do. I do visual research, I do textual research. So for example, with this blues book, I had to figure out things about what it was like to live in the Mississippi Delta in the 1930s. That was something I wanted to kind of portray. Currently, I'm working on a book about American history. And I want to know, you know, what did the space shuttle look like when they had that tragedy with the Challenger? I want to see what that looked like so that I can have some real live, so I can root the images in something real. One of the things that I believe is that the more specific you are, the more easily people will relate to what you do, because they will see things in it that you never saw. So for example, when I draw a neighborhood, I draw my neighborhood. I draw specific neighborhoods. I don't just draw a building, because a building in and of itself maybe not an iconographic building, just building the concept, people don't relate to as well as a home, a place that has some kind of emotional or physical weight.
You did some interesting research for Jabberwocky even.
Oh, well, Jabberwocky, I spent a lot of time with Jabberwocky researching Lewis Carroll because I wanted to find connections that he may have had to basketball and to this kind of, so I did a lot of research on Lewis Carroll and James Naismith, the man who invented basketball, and saw all these overlaps in their life. So they're both doctors of divinity and all these kind of things. The idea is that if you're interested in stories, the way I'm interested in stories, you are passionate about collecting those stories. You want to know the backstory behind everything. And that's one of the ways that I live, is like always trying to find the story behind the story until I find a story that I think is worthy of telling or that tells something to me.
Okay. I think we're almost ready to answer questions from the audience. And if not, I have one more.
Does the audience have questions? Y'all better have questions. Are we okay?
I'm not sure we are.
Oh, maybe we're not.
Maybe we're not.
Questions. Never mind then. I don't want your questions now. That's technical difficulties. That's how that happens.
Well, I always have more questions. One of the most intriguing books that I think is extremely powerful is Monster, and you used photography to illustrate this book.
Right. Well, I mean, with Monster and Autobiography of My Dead Brother, and then after I talk about those two books, then we're going to ask questions. So get your questions ready. My father and I are both interested and disturbed by both images of criminality in the African American community and like what everyone comes up, all these cats like 50, like T.I., like, you know, come up and they talk about their criminal pasts as if it's cool. And that's kind of disturbing. I was at with a prison youth group in Arlington, Virginia. This is a number of years back. And I was asking them who their heroes were. And somebody said 50 Cent. And I said, 50 Cent, what do we all know about him? He got shot 9 times. And I've had friends who've been shot. That's not good. You know, there's nothing cool about that. This kid, Randy, got shot in his stomach and couldn't play ball anymore. You know, and so we wanted to do something about that. We wanted to make some work that dealt with those images of criminality, of death that are being peddled to our communities.
Well, in Monster, Steve Harmon is accused of accessory to felony murder, and he finds himself in jail. And he's trying to figure out whether he's a monster, because that's how the world sees him. Yeah. And so, I mean, but the images you create are...
Well, the images are all about those common images of criminality that kind of, who has seen an image like this before, of the mugshot? We all have, and that's something that we see on a daily basis, and we think, and we have all kinds of assumptions about people who they have mugshots of.
Does it mean they're a criminal?
It doesn't mean that necessarily that they're a criminal,
Yeah.
but it's something that we were interested in. We have questions from the audience now. We ready?
What's your favorite thing about being a writer?
What's my favorite thing about being a writer? I think it's the best job in the world, really, to tell the truth. I think that being a writer is the best job in the world because I can, number one, I don't have to go anywhere in the mornings. I get to talk about things that I care about. Like I get to talk about my community. I get to talk about my extended family of readers and authors and this sort of thing. I get to talk about the world, and I get to have a voice, you know, and I get to see things like how they make music videos and how do people do things in the world that I think for most people are kind of opaque. So, you know, when you read a magazine article, like how does that come to happen? I know those people who do that. So I love that community as well.
Okay, we have an email. The email is from Virginia. What are your other abilities and interests?
What are my hobbies and interests? I'll tell the truth. I draw a lot, and I do fine arts as well. So I spend a lot of my time making sculpture. I do a lot of fabric work with sculpture. I do some welding, some metal work. Right now I'm working on a body of sculpture about people who were put on display in the late 1800s. So back in the day, they used to take, like, let's say somebody like me had big feet, and they put them on display, and they, you know, the incredible Bigfoot boy. And so I've made a bunch of work about some of these people that I did a lot of historical research on. These people who were put on display in the late 1800s. So that's one thing I do. I listen to a lot of music. I try to go dancing as much as possible. I play a mean game of ping pong. But those are. So I travel a lot as well. I'm trying to travel as much as possible. So last year I spent about a month and a half in China. I went to Beijing and got an apartment there and hung out. And this year I'm trying to go to West Africa for a bit. I've got some friends in Ghana. I'm gonna go see. Then in Sierra Leone, I want to talk to some child soldier kids. Okay. So I do everything I can, you know. And that's part of also what I love about this job is it gives me the freedom to do that kind of thing. Okay,
we have another question from the audience.
What's your favorite book you've ever written?
What's my favorite? The one I'm working on right now. No, I mean, I tell you, each of my books, and maybe your books too, if you've written many, I don't know. But each of the books has its own purpose and its own reason for being. And so each book for me kind of takes a little chunk out of things that I'm interested in. So, you know, I'm not one of those people who makes the same book over and over and over again. So it doesn't make it easy for me to come up with a favorite. So you talk about, like, what's my favorite book in terms of talking about violence and youth. The book I came out with recently with my pop, Autobiography of My Dead Brother, right. In which a kid gets involved in some gun violence because it spoke to me at the time. If you want to talk about, like, my favorite book that I think is kind of funny, I did a book of Zora Neale Hurston's anthropological work called Lies, and I enjoyed making that. I made a bunch of quilts for that. So you don't have necessarily a favorite book, but you enjoy all of them differently, you know.
We have another email question. What were the steps in getting your first book published?
Does that email person, are they trying to get if the email person is trying to get their own books published, my suggestion is don't, because I don't need competition. I don't need anybody trying to take away dollars out of my pocket. But if you're not trying to and you're just curious about how to publish a book, the main thing, there's two basic steps to publishing a book, and these are the things that stop most people. Number one is finishing a book, writing it. You know, a lot of people come to me and they say, I've got an idea about a book. you should do a book about a frog. And then they leave it at that. And I'm like, an idea, you can't sell an idea. You're not going to go to a publisher talking about, yo, HarperCollins, I got this idea. It's about a frog. It's hot. No one's going to give you money for that. But if you do the manuscript, then you have a chance to publish it. So number one is finish it. Number two is send it out. Every book that you'll ever get has the address of the publisher there. Send it to the publisher. You may get rejected, but you may also find out that I met a 12-year-old girl who published a book about potatoes. She was from Idaho. I mean, I'm not into potatoes, but the idea is that if you do the work, you can find. If you do the work and you can put it on the table, you can leave it. If you're a musician, if you're an actor, if you can say, here's my demo tape, here's my manuscript, there it is, and you're not riding on trying to convince somebody of your own value, then you can do it, and you can find a way to send that book out, send that demo tape to a publishing company or a music company and get it produced.
Okay. We have another email question who wants to know what your favorite medium to work in is.
My favorite medium to work in? I really don't have a favorite medium. I
Talk
work
about some of your media.
Okay, I did a book. Every book, I'm a master of overkill. I do too much work all the time, and I like that. I like to do too much work. So, for example, this book, Blue's Journey, I did with just blue ink and brown paper bags. That's and some white paint. So that's that. And that was really a challenge. That was really fun.
What kind of paint?
To figure out, just acrylic.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And just to figure out if I could make a rich, full book with only 3 materials. However, with this book, this is one of my earlier books. It's called Harlem. With this book, I did it with all cut pieces of magazines because I read a lot of magazines, and it's cheap. It's cheap to find pieces of magazines, but also so that I could refigure what's in those magazines and make what's in those magazines look different.
Okay. You had a question.
When you work with your father, does he have any input on what you draw for your illustrations?
Good question. No. Good question. No. I'll tell you though, working with my dad is a great thing. But he's very not visual. So that's one thing. And then it's really, for us, it's a challenge to kind of keep up with each other. It's like 2 people working in 2 different mediums, and he does something, and then my challenge is to keep up with him. And then I do something, and then he'll sometimes have to keep up with me. So that's exciting, that sense of competition. It's also really cool for our relationship because, like your dad, your parent may be always sort of like, they're always going to be your parent, but if you have another way to relate to them outside of that parent-child thing, it's kind of cool. So. Okay.
We have another email question, and that they want to know who your favorite author is and who's your favorite illustrator.
Oh, well, I mean, there's a lot. I have a lot of favorites because you talk about doing research. I write and I read all the time. So I have a lot of favorites. I'm trying to think of some of them. Okay, I have a lot of favorite poets. One is a guy named Sherman Alexie. I love Sherman Alexie. He's a Native American cat from Seattle. And he writes poems, he writes novels, he just writes. Yeah. I love what he does. Another one is a woman, Canadian woman poet named Anne Carson, who wrote a book called The Autobiography of Red, which I recommend to anybody because it's just so good. There's very few words in the whole book, but the book is so tight and so real. So those are 2. I mean, I love. There's a lot of writers. I like a guy named Paul Beatty a lot, a poet and novelist.
What about illustrators?
Then, in terms of illustrators, I mean, there's people who are always in your top 10. So, for example, the Dylans. You look at the Dylans, and you see their work, and you don't know how it's made, and it's kind of amazing in that way, where it's just so perfect. I'm trying to think of other ones though. John Muth.
Oh yeah.
Who does watercolor paintings that are really amazing. At the same time, though, I tell you, with illustrators especially, I feel competitive. Kadir Nelson's really good. I like him. But I'm also really competitive, so I have a tendency to be like, oh, yeah, I don't like him, even though I do, because I don't like anyone beating me.
Okay.
And then there's a bunch of artists that I love as well. You know, David Hammonds, Basquiat. If you have a chance, Basquiat was this guy in the 80s who started out doing graffiti and then started doing it on canvas. And his stuff always blows my mind. I'd love to do a book with him, like about him. I mean, he's passed away now. But.
We have very little time before we have to close, but could you just elaborate? What is the relation? Is graffiti art?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, my main thing is, do you do the work? Okay. And you can always ask, you can always see something. When you see something and you see if it has had work put into it, then it is work. Then it is art to me. I mean, if you see that someone spent days and days and years.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time. It's amazing how quickly this hour went. I'd like to thank you, Christopher Myers, for being with us today. I'd also like to thank the students in the studio audience. Thanks, too, to the viewing audience from across the country for tuning into the program.
Meet the artists after the show. You and your students can ask questions of the artists after each broadcast by emailing us at kcperfarts@aol.com. Don't forget to visit us online. There you'll find dozens of archived programs from previous seasons that feature artists such as members of the National Symphony Orchestra, Ballet Hispanico, the Billy Taylor Trio, lyricist Stephen Schwartz, cast members from Maine, and many more. Prepare for each program by downloading the study guide. Each guide includes background information about the artists, instructional activities, and additional resources to use in the classroom. The Kennedy Center Performing Arts Series, bringing the arts to your classroom. Full Circle Productions will have you breaking, locking, and up-rocking before the end of this high-energy hip-hop program with some of the most talented B-boys and B-girls around. Quickstep and Rockefeller take students behind the scenes of hip-hop and examine the culture and aesthetics of this urban dance form through discussion and demonstration. Previously recorded Full Circle Productions Hip Hop to the Head will be broadcast on Friday, November 16th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. The Kennedy Center Performing Arts Series, bringing the arts to your classroom.